I don't have a library. I know, it's, I've got some things online, you might know. So thank you very much, Frank, and thanks for having us along. I acknowledge that I'm standing on Aboriginal land. So I wanted to start somewhere that Frank left off, and I suppose I want to ask a couple of questions which are maybe a little bit confounding. One is, I'm going to suggest we're not only losing, we're partly winning, and that's useful because it's good to think about how we might be winning things and how we could win more things. We're not winning as many things as we're losing, but we are winning some things, and it's good to know that we're winning some things. And the other is how the way that the economy's shifted has changed the kinds of political alliances in our community that can confound the way that we do campaigning and the way that we do win things, and which allow, I think we can say, the top 1% to continue to rule. So let's start with those fire industries. So the finance, insurance and real estate. And absolutely true, they're growing in Australia, they're growing around the world, they're particularly growing in the Anglo-Saxon countries like Australia and the United States. Absolutely that growth is directly aligned with the increase in the incomes of the super rich and wealth accumulation of the super rich. Absolutely true. And it's also true that that is generating greater instability. It's one of the things that contributed to things like the global financial crisis, but also to the series of crises before that in the East Asian crisis, the dot-com bubble, and so forth. But I suppose I might take a slight issue with the conclusion from the article in Australian Options and suggest that if we took away the fire industry, it's not that the Australian economy would be going backwards, because they're not really producing the things they're getting. It's just that other people would get it instead. That is, that the amount of stuff that we're producing would probably stay roughly the same, but different people would end up getting it. And that particularly goes for one of the largest chunks of it, which is caught up with real estate and the stock market, which is essentially a way of just reallocating income and wealth by changing the relative prices of things. Yeah? So if we put all of the house prices in Sydney up, we effectively give windfall gains to all the people who own those properties, and we essentially take money off all the people who have to work to be able to pay rents and mortgages. That's essentially what's just happened. And it really has just happened. That's exactly what's been going on. There's a lovely guy on Twitter, Leo Pat Ross. You can have a look at him at his Twitter handle, who regularly tweets from the sale of houses, the equivalent income that their owner has made from the time they bought it to the time they sold it as a weekly income. So they divide the price and they add up. And the weekly income is often what many part-time workers and even what some full-time workers would earn. There's just buying and selling one property in Sydney over the last 10 or 20 years gets you as much money as having worked full-time. Like, that's just remarkable. So how on earth has that been allowed to happen? Because that's at the heart of the generator of inequality that's been going on. And I think this goes to the kind of weird alliances that have been generated by the way we have changed policy making in Australia. So I've just told you house prices have skyrocketed, rich people have got richer, and that something about those two things is directly related. So obviously, it's only rich people who own property, but that's completely not the case in Australia. So if we go and look at who is it that's most likely to own their home outright, it's not workers, but it's also not business owners. The group that's most likely to own their own home outright are people on government benefits, because they're age pensioners. So we have this perplexing situation where we've had a change in the economy that favours the super rich, but it also happens to have favoured a large group of actually ordinary working people, now retired working people, but ordinary working people. And that has set up a generational divide, which I'm going to suggest is not really about generations, but is about the way that capital markets take so long to readjust themselves, particularly owning property. So it just takes forever to buy a house. Yeah. So the reason that people who are retired have been able to access this broadly egalitarian form of home ownership, not completely egalitarian, but relative to what young people face today, is because they bought their houses in a completely different market, under completely different policy settings. at a time when wages were relatively more egalitarian and when the capital share was relatively lower and wages share was relatively higher. And they locked in those gains and so have happened to experience some of these benefits later on. But when we look at the distribution of those benefits, it's true that each of those individual house owners has got a bit of it, but they've got nothing like what a very small group of large-scale investors has got. But when we think about, well, how do we then mobilise people to be able to change the world and make policies better, we find we've got a bit of a dilemma. The interests of the top 0.1% happen to align with the interests of a whole bunch of retired homeowners. And that is actually a really serious political challenge. Because one of the biggest things that's been going on over the last 30 or 40 years is that all the things that we think that markets do relatively well, to the extent that any of you think markets do anything particularly well, those things have all been declining. They've been declining as a proportion of how much we spend, of how big the economy is, and of how many people are employed in them. So they're things like electronics, agriculture, even going out and eating, your clothes, all of those things, employing less people, we're spending less money on them, and they're shrinking as a proportion of the economy. That's true for all of them. They're the things that are at the very cutting edge of automation, and that's partly what's driving that. So what are the things that have been growing? Healthcare, education, housing, childcare, all growing as a proportion of people we employ, growing as a proportion of the economy, of how much money we spend. All things that we associate with government. And so part of what's been going on has been a straitjacket on what governments have been allowed to spend and tax. Governments actually spend more on all of those things now than they did 30 years ago. Believe it or not, even with all of the neoliberal reform, governments now, including the Australian government, spend more of their money on those things than they did before, and they do so in a more egalitarian way. More of their money gets dedicated to low-income earners and less to high-income earners. But the restructuring of, I know that sounds kind of remarkable. It's actually true. It is actually true that the Australian government now spends more money on social spending than it did before as a proportion of the economy, and that is more redistributive than it was before. But that's partly because these market incomes have gone so wildly unequal over that period that even with that change, everything has still become more unequal. Inequality is rising, and particularly at the top, as Frank said. And that's partly because governments haven't been able to keep up with the growth of these services. So their spending, while it's rising, is not rising in line with the demand and the expansion of healthcare, education, childcare and housing. They haven't been. So what we've been doing is gradually privatising and marketising all of those things to try and make up the gap between the government spending and the size of how much we actually have to pay to make it work. Yep. And all those user charges, they are very unfair and inegalitarian. Yep. But the thing that's been growing fastest of all of them, of all of those things, the thing that we spend most money on and has been growing fastest is housing. And that spending has been growing at a rate of knots which can only really be explained by the inflation of the prices. It's not anything else. But strangely, housing is the one thing we don't really tax properly. So this shift of the economy has not only meant that governments have to spend more money, it's been growing the one thing that they can't, well, they can, that they haven't been willing to tax properly. So we don't tax the family home directly very much at all, but we don't even tax investment properties particularly effectively. We have exemptions for capital gains tax, we have exemptions for negative gearing. And when you look at the costs of those things, so the exemptions for housing-related taxes, which we know from the tax expenditure statement, the scale of those taxes is about the amount you would need to introduce a kind of basic income for everyone in the country that was a little bit higher than Newstart, which is a lot of money. Like we're talking close to $100 billion a year. This astronomically high amount of money. But it's very hard to close it off because when you do, you meet this weird coalition of interests where you do have a genuine problem of older people on low incomes who have access to this wealth, who are going to be hit, not a lot, but they'll be hit a little bit and they'll really feel it. But they are used as a frontline defence to make sure that those tax concessions stay there for the people who don't get $1,000 a year out of them, but get $10 million a year out of them. So we need to think through how we can manage a renegotiation of all of this. And that's going to be a little bit difficult. But I think we do have some things that have been being won. And how am I going for time, Mary?
Could you do it in 5 minutes?
I can do it in 5 minutes. Okay. So a couple of things. I wanted to finish by saying there's a couple of things we've started to win. There's a couple of opportunities, I think, where we can win a little bit more. So when I say that governments have been spending more money on these things, that doesn't just happen, obviously. Governments don't just sit around being really nice and go, how can we give people nice stuff to have? The reason that's happened is because there have been very effective campaigns to win those things. So we now have new spending we didn't have 30 years ago. We have paid parental leave. We have childcare that is heavily subsidised or directly provided, largely subsidised, unfortunately. We're about to get, in the processes of getting, a national disability insurance scheme. Those things are not just because governments had something and the cost of it went up. They're because there were new political campaigns that mobilised people, that made direct demands of politicians, and that won things at the ballot box and forced changes. That's how that happened. And those things have happened actually quite recently, some of them. It's entirely possible to win these things. I think the Change the Rules campaign that the ACTU has announced is one of probably the most exciting shifts in this landscape for quite some time, and it absolutely has the ability to win. And it absolutely has the ability to redistribute income back from capital to workers. And if it does, that's going to make a real difference. And it is going to start to reverse inequality. So we can win these things. At the other end, back in my housing story, because unfortunately housing is so much a part of this story, we've also started to see a real shift on the rights of renters. When I started analysing this stuff like about 10 years ago and started talking to people about, you could kind of see this crisis coming, and it's unfortunately going to get a little bit worse from here because of that long lag time in how long it takes people to buy houses. The gradual erosion of home ownership takes place over a very long period of time. At the moment, it's really hit people under 35. It's partly hit people under 55. It really hasn't hit anyone above that much yet. It's just starting to a little bit now. But when I started saying that, we said, well, one of the main things we need to do is guarantee rights for renters. We're going to have a growing number of people who are in private rental for long periods of time, if not their entire lives. We have some of the worst rental protections in the world, partly because we had high home ownership and there was no one to campaign for them. And politicians don't respond if there's no one to campaign for things. So we've got to do something about this. But we know that about 15 to 20% of the population own investment properties because most of our landlords are small-scale landlords. And that 15 to 20% of people are systematically much wealthier than the people who are renting, right? Almost by definition they are. So, generally speaking, political influence equals number of people times how much money they've got. That's a rough equation, but it kind of works. So I was looking at that equation and going, we've got a lot of renters, but they're poor, and we've got actually quite a lot of investors and they're pretty rich. There's no way we're going to do this. We've lost already. But what was really surprising is not only has that issue caught a light amongst people under the age of 30, and it really has, but that there is another political coalition that comes from people's real lived experience. Having door knocked on this stuff, I know that when you knock on someone who's 65's door in the inner city of Sydney, they say, I'm absolutely for stronger rental protections, even though I own an investment property because my kids can't live around here anymore and they've had to move 3 times in the last 2 years. And that real lived experience is actually very powerful, and building a coalition around that is entirely possible. We've already seen a shift in Victoria. We're starting to see a shift in New South Wales, where Labor has now signed up to this, and the coalition is already starting to say that they're going to deliver something before the next state election, despite their biggest backers being the real estate industry. So it is possible to be able to build these things, but they have to be based on those real lived experiences, on the experiences of inequality and insecurity that we know we all feel, being able to make them public and visible, and then being able to organise around them so everyone can see them and can feel like they can do something about them. When we do that, we really can change things. I think that's already started to happen with the Change the Rules campaign. I think it's starting to happen with housing as well. And that makes me think we've at least got a fighting chance to try and reverse the wave of inequality that's been coming towards us. Thanks very much.